Welcome to Lean Whiskey, our first episode of 2023. Good to see everybody. And of course, Mark, good to see you as always.
Yeah, Jamie, great to see you. Happy New Year, even though, we're a little far into January, but I'll say it.
A little far into it, although I find myself, everybody I talk to for the first time, I still have to say it, I guess. Yeah. And I'm not terribly superstitious about the magic of turning the calendar to a new page, but I'm personally hoping for a better 2023. So
if you're not,
I'll accept the superstition this time.
Are you just a little bit stitious?
I'm a little bit superstitious.
Stitious, all right.
I was always superstitious about travel myths and I never wanted to tempt the travel gods just because it seemed they had it out for me, but most other superstitions I didn't follow, including Friday the 13th and things like that. But yep, I'll accept 2023 new, maybe not new year, new me, but at least new year, new something. So
to be healthy, wealthy, and wise. Is that the?
I'll just take healthy. I'll take healthy.
Take healthier.
Wealthy is what it is, and wise is I'm either locked and loaded or not. So I'll just take the healthy.
Yeah. Well, we're excited about one of our friends, whiskey maker. I think he's going to have an exciting 2023 ahead. So why don't we talk about that?
Yeah, it's super exciting to see a whiskey of the year. In this case, U.S. micro whiskey of the year from the Jim Murray Whiskey Bible, which is really the standard.
This is I've got a 2014 copy. Land.
Okay. Yeah. So it comes out every year, which is a great way to, keep selling books, and they review everything under the sun and they give out some awards. And so the US micro whiskey of the year is Glens Creek Distillery OCD number 5, which is, as you know, always been a favorite of mine.
And I know we've mentioned Glens Creek and our friend Dave Meier, and here's a bottle of OCD number 5. I forgot to go back and look at exactly what episode. We can link.
Yeah, it's in there somewhere.
It's I don't know, a validation that one of our favorite whiskeys is a big award winner now. So congratulations to Dave and the whole team there at Glens Creek.
Yep. So it's well done.
Hey.
Whoop.
Hey, look who we have here.
You?
Somebody sent me a message, said you were talking about me.
How'd you get in?
Well, I've got my ways.
He's the original lean whiskey master. So he's got an open invitation. But David, the creator of OCD number 5 and Glens Creek Distillery, congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you. It's really an honor, I think, to be recognized, as you guys know, for what you do and for that people appreciate it. And certainly we have a lot of customers, a lot of repeat customers, and that's a great indication that we're doing something here. You guys, Mark, you've been here a couple of times. Mm-hmm. Jamie, you've been here. And but Jim Murray, to be recognized at that level and to be put up next to some pretty amazing products is really it's really great, and we're very excited about it.
Yeah, well, it's to make a connection to lean. It's sort of like a Shingo Prize for whiskey.
Yeah, exactly. I have a Shingo Prize too, but
yeah,
that was another life, a different life. But I think there's a lot of correlation here and what we're doing, and just looking at problem solving and improving, applying Kaizen thinking, and we've managed to go from 4 barrels a month to now up to 23, 24 barrels a month, and without the addition of cost, and by process improvements and applying some of the things we know. And like every other workplace, there's still constant challenges. There's things are not going to work right. People are going to make mistakes. Things are going to, challenge you all the time. And you just have to keep working at it. And, 7 years now, we're an overnight overnight success with the kind of recognition that we're starting to get, and that's really great and gratifying,
When I was there in December visiting you, I remember you saying that, Dave. It's really it's all about problem solving, which I think is a great lesson for a distillery or for any business. Sort of like, well, what lean tool should we implement? I mean, it sounds like, problem solving.
Right. Yeah. It's always starting with that question: what problem are you trying to solve? And looking at that, and what's really fascinating to me, because I reflect on this a lot, this idea of Kaizen, improving, and sometimes I was on the Moonshiners TV show, and they came here to explore the sour mash and the sour mash process. So I went back online and I looked up Dr. Crow's supposed recipe where he was sour mashing, and this time, the first time I looked at it, which was years ago, it's kind of like, oh, okay, here's his recipe, and here's here's how he made whiskey or something. And this time, the question was a little different. I was looking at it from the standpoint of what was the purpose? What were they really trying to do, and what did they really understand, and so on. And so, as I looked at that again from a different angle, I realized that maybe we could take some of those ideas that they were applying and apply those in our own case. And, we had been doing things a certain way because it seemed to me like that's what everybody said, the way you're supposed to do it. And what I'm referring to really is the water to grain ratio when you cook the grain. And as I thought about that, then I realized, we could actually heat up less water, which is an energy savings, increase the amount of grain in that water, and then add cool water, which is kind of what they were doing. You're adding cool water afterwards to kind of bring the temperature down to the point where you can do the next step. And so we were able to increase our yield from previous record of 18 barrels a month to the last 2 months were 23 and 24 barrels. And so what strikes me sometimes is kind of like, what took so long to come to that realization? Why didn't we realize that a long time ago? And I think sometimes, I don't know, it's like the saying that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And to me, it's like when the student is ready, the idea appears, that you suddenly realize, oh, here's a different way to think about it, or a different way to go about it. And, you have to constantly work to not just keep doing it the same way, but to constantly rethink that and ask the questions sort of in a different way. And again, the last time I looked at his recipe was, what is he doing? And this time I looked at it as, why is he doing it that way? And for what purpose? And so that kind of caused me to rethink it. So the TV show, while it caused me to re-look at things and to come up with some improvement. So we're trying to do that all the time. It's as you well know, you look around any workplace and there's everything could be improved, and nothing is at the perfect state. And so it's more, some days it's like, okay, that situation has bugged me long enough that today's the day that I'm going to do something about it and resolve it. Because there's no shortage. I mean, we say it's a distillery, there's always something broken or needing to be fixed or repaired or whatever. So,
well, I think it's a matter of it's either bugging you enough, or sometimes you finally see the problem, or, to make a lean point, not a whiskey point. I work with people in healthcare. When they start to see waste and problems, they'll go through cycles of grief where they get really upset of like, well, why didn't we notice this problem before? Why didn't we fix it before? And I try to coach them. Like, I mean, easier said than done. You can't tell someone don't feel bad, but this happens.
Well, yeah, I think you and I talked about that in December, and that I even after all these years and in my own experience and knowing better, sometimes I feel that way. You look at it and go, gosh, what took so long? Why didn't I see that? But it's not it's not personal. The situation comes to your attention when it's time to come to your attention, I guess. And just because you didn't recognize it before, again, my situation I just explained, something caused me to look at it different. Right? If that hadn't occurred, I may never have looked at it in a different way, and I may never have found a different possibility. So I kind of explore that notion and realize that, okay, when a situation comes up and we realize we can make an improvement, I'll look at it and I'll think, what was the obstacle kind of in the way that didn't allow us to see that sooner? And what was it that kind of pushed us past that? And is there some way that you can incorporate that in your daily thinking so that you can initiate it? And that's why they say the outside eyes, because the outside eyes aren't used to it. You walk in a situation, it looks the same to you every day. You do the same thing every day. It's normal, natural, and effective. And so you keep doing it. Somebody else might come in and say, hey, have you ever thought about this? Or what about that? And so that can also spur the thinking. So,
yeah, you've really got to have that learner's mindset to be open to any of that, though. And, I think the whiskey field on both sides of the counter are filled with just that's how you're supposed to do it. Don't question it. Don't be open to new ideas. So on the consumer side, there's a lot of norms and standards from how you drink it to, you should always pay above market price for anything from Buffalo Trace and a whole bunch of silly things like that. They're just accepted as this is how it is. Don't ask, don't question it, because if you do, you lose your membership card. And even on the production side, there's plenty of, well, this is what you're supposed to do. This is what we've done for hundreds of years. And I still recall, when you were taking me through your process and we got to walk around. I mean, you really were approaching it from let's try to understand what makes a great whiskey, and be curious about that and be experimental about that. Always be, trying some new things. And so if you're not open to that, you could have some great learning come your way, but it'll never enter in where it's supposed to.
Right.
And integrate with the rest of the knowledge.
Yeah, that's a great point. I sort of analyzed the industry myself and finally came to the realization that a big challenge here is it's not at all lean from the standpoint of just in time, distill it today, sell it tomorrow, only distill what's already sold or what your customers already purchased or any of those kind of notions. And so the industry, by and large, has billions of dollars invested in the possibility of, something working out in the future. And so they were very, very reluctant to change anything because of that. Yeah. Because you've got such great risk between the day you distill it and the day you might bottle it and sell it. Years of inventory, billions of dollars kind of thing. And so the advantage we have of being smaller, and we have the advantage of flexibility, and we have the advantage that we can make a small experiment and try something out, and don't have billions of dollars invested, and don't have to be concerned about we can't change a thing. I mean, there's this. You talked about superstition earlier, and there's almost a superstition in this business that you don't want to change a thing, because if you change something and you find out, 4, 6, 8, 10 years later that it didn't work out, you're kind of in trouble at that point. So,
right. So I wanted to ask you about these different barrels, and I'm going to admit a mistake here. You talked about learning from mistakes, and you did an episode of My Favorite Mistake with me, Dave. But I intended from our stash here to open up a bottle from Barrel 23 that you've signed. It says 2018. And then one shelf had a Barrel 54, which must have been from our next visit. Well, me being a knucklehead, I managed to open a different bottle, and I have 2 bottles from the same barrel. So my side-by-side tasting is... That's not a good exercise.
But I've
They should taste pretty much the same. Now, if you get two different barrels, you're likely to notice some difference for sure.
That's what I wanted to ask about. But Jamie, which one do you have?
Yeah, I've got barrel 66. So that's what I've I've cracked today. But you know, we can read, you know, we can read, you know, Jim Murray's tasting notes, and Mark and I try not to do tasting notes on this show because
Not good at it.
we're just not pros in that category. But what are, you know, how do you describe OCD number 5 to somebody?
Tastes like bourbon.
Yeah.
You know, we don't do that either. You know, I you know, I can, when I'm tasting with visitors, we can talk more effectively about, for example, a sensation. Okay. Oh, I get sweetness on the front of my tongue at the beginning of that, or oh, I get a little spicy, peppery on the finish, or oh, it's, you know, tingling on the back of my tongue, or that sort of thing. You know, what you taste is really subjective, and you know, I don't know if some of those guys really taste those things or not. What I'd love to do is conduct an experiment. Probably never happen, to say, okay, bring in a, you know, panel of these tasting experts, 6 or 7 people, do some blind tasting, write down your notes, write down your you know, what you taste, and then send them away, have them come back a couple months later and open the same ones and do the same tasting and compare the notes and see how close they are, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you know, you could probably memorize a list of typical flavor notes and descriptions that you might get out of a product. But people come in and ask me, you know, well, what does this one taste like? Bourbon. You know, okay, you taste it yourself. I mean, that's the only real way to do it, is you got to taste it yourself. Now, if you find some reviewer who recommends something and then you go and taste it and you agree, oh, that's really good, I like that. And over time you realize, well, this person has a similar preference to what you have, then maybe you can kind of rely on their suggestions. But if you go online and look under any product, you're going to see people who love it, you're going to see people who don't love it, and that's just normal. You know, there are some prevalent flavors that are present, some vanillins, cinnaminoids. You know, these are chemicals that we know are present, and pretty much they're derived from the wood. Right. And you know, if you're putting your product in the wood for some period of time, you're going to have those notes present. But other than that, I just, you know, I said, look, just try it. And for us, it's simple. You like it or you don't. And so.
I love that description and explanation. And, you know, we have a no judgment sort of policy around whiskey. And, you know, you want to put it on ice. You want to mix Pappy and Diet Coke, you know. Well, your drink, yeah. It's your glass, so do whatever you want to do. But
I concur with you there, except the fact that, you know, if you're going to pay that much for something, it doesn't make sense to put it with Coke. Go and buy a nice everyday drinking bourbon that's, you know, $25-$30 and mix it with Coke. I don't have a problem if you want to take our stuff and mix it with Coke. It's your money and you can spend it how you want. But I think there's some very expensive products that you know, it just from a frugal guy standpoint, it just doesn't make sense to spend that much money and then cover it up with something and you don't taste what's actually going on.
Yep.
I was going to ask you, Dave. Looking at what Jim Murray wrote here, it looks like he tasted barrel number 83, and right. Every single barrel is different. Right. Do you feel like newer barrels? Do you think there's been an evolution in how your bourbon tastes like bourbon? Is it Kaizen flavor that seeps in over time, or is it pretty consistent?
You know, that's a great question, and it's a difficult one to answer. I think that what we talk about, and I've been talking about more lately, is my concern is that we may, so we're testing some barrels right now. We pull samples from barrels, we taste them, we decide whether we think one is ready to go. It's not a question of whether it's good or not good, or good or bad. It's a question of, is it ready? Has the wood done enough? Has it been there? You know, do you get the flavors that you want from the wood and so on? And I think sometimes for us, for me in particular, we're on barrel 100 now. So if I sample something, I'm mentally comparing it to, 100 barrels and saying, all right, is it in that range? I mean, does it qualify to go up there against those guys? And then the other concern is, so I might be too harsh on ourselves to say, okay, we have a higher expectation now as time goes on. Maybe the concern is if we put something out there that's not quite going to do it. But I can tell you this: those concerns are unfounded. I know that. I know that because it doesn't matter what we put on the table. It doesn't taste bad. So that's the key. And what I can tell you with certainty is that some people will like it, some people will not. And that's normal, and that's okay. I don't think there's any product out there that's going to have universal acceptance no matter what.
Sure.
Okay. And we have, and Jim Murray talks about it, I think, the OCD premium. He didn't list it as a premium, but he talks about how we make it. And I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of 95% of people who taste that are just blown away by it and really, really enjoy it. But there's a few who say, you know what, I like the regular OCD better. It's the premium is fuller, more complex. It's got more wood action going on, and some people like their bourbon a little bit lighter, if you will.
So was that the one that he listed 96 points DB? Does that mean double barreled?
I got to go back and look and see what DB means, but no, it wasn't double barreled. I kept seeing that on his reviews, and I haven't gone back to the front to see what his code is for that. I think it's something about distillery barrel or something to that effect.
I've got the book here, and it stands for distillery bottling. Expression brought out by owners of the distillery.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, well, guys, I don't want to hold up your show. I know you got things to talk about here, and I just wanted to pop in and thank you for mentioning us again and for enjoying what we do here.
Yeah.
Well, cheers to you, the team, and more success.
Yeah. So hopefully you guys can get down here again. Mark, you're not too far away now, so no real excuses.
I'm only an hour and a half away, and here's a stretch goal for the year. Like, without having to hire a camera crew or something, maybe Jamie and I can both be there, and we can do an episode together in person with you.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Love to do it.
Well, again, congratulations, Dave. We'll post all kinds of links.
Well, happy New Year, and hopefully a better one for you, Jamie, this year.
Yep. Be well.
All right. Thanks, you too, guys. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Dave. I'm so excited for him, and maybe a question for next time is, did he forecast getting this recognition?
Well, that's the thing, because you see these things that when they become popular, you can't find them, and so selfishly, I'm a little nervous that I won't be able to find what is probably my favorite bourbon out there. So, and I can't find it in Pennsylvania anyway, I certainly hope it does fly off the shelf. I think that'll be, great for his business and his brand and his recognition. Right outside Lexington, I'll say not right outside, but outside Lexington, and, an easy stop for a tour. And, we didn't really talk about it this time, but I mean, this is just one of many whiskeys that he has, right? All sorts of different whiskeys, continuing. It really, Four Roses, which is also not far away, still only has 4 whiskeys. and at least in terms of different expressions and different bottlings, he can blow them away. And so that continued, I'll say, curiosity and exploration, experimentation is great to see what they're doing.
I'm going to hold that up for the camera for those who are watching. But yeah, I want to go drive down and visit and buy a couple more bottles, not to hoard it, but before the book is officially out and the word gets out. But you're right. There's the OCD bourbon. And if I remember right, it's 70% corn, 20% rye, 10% barley. He's also got a whiskey he calls it sweet, where you replace the rye with barley.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. You replace the rye with wheat, and it's the same 70-20-10, but corn, wheat, and barley. And the last time I did a side by side of those, I mean, I like the OCD number 5. I think I like a wheated bourbon. So the sweet is really nice. And then also getting rave reviews in the Whiskey Bible was a release of his that was born out of a mistake. The Cobb, the corn only bourbon. We'll get Dave to tell the story someday. But when I was there in December, he was talking about how like someone, meaning him, forgot to order rye. And somebody working there, if I'm remembering this right, said, well, let's try making something that's 100% corn rather than sit and do nothing. So,
yep. No, that's awesome. And yeah, I haven't had either of those. I've had, it's still on my cart is Cuervo Vivo.
Puerto Vivo? Yeah.
Yeah, Cuervo Vivo. I think that's right. The OCD number 5 and Cafe Olé.
Cafe Olé. Jim Murray also liked that a lot. Not that I'm looking for the validation that I love that, but
I love both of those. I honestly I had to open this bottle for tonight because I was hanging on to it. I didn't want to open it because then it would be my last. I knew once I opened it, it'll be my, the end of my OCD number 5 until I make it over there again.
So again, me being a knucklehead, thankfully whiskey doesn't go bad the way wine does when you've opened it. But I mean, if anything, I'm tasting the difference between a half-empty bottle that's been open for a couple of years versus a brand new bottle. No real difference. But
I in terms of experimentation and understanding cause and effect, there's these really a myth that your whiskey can oxidize, and it's been proven that really isn't a problem. Sunlight, is a problem.
I've had 2 bottles that I can remember that were very low, and I think they had gone bad. Like you can tell when that's happened. One was, I think, a bottle of Johnny Walker Green Label Scotch, which is probably my favorite Johnny Walker. And then one other bottle recently, and that's the risk. Like, so I've got kind of a
if you're down to a final pour, finish it. But like basically, there's I could keep this bottle on the shelf like this for years, and it's really not going to be a problem as long as it's not getting a lot of sunlight.
Yeah. And then since we're mentioning wheated bourbon and Jim Murray U.S. Micro Whiskey of the Year recipients, I'm going to make a gratuitous book plug here as well. So behind me on my shelf is a Garrison Brothers Ball Murray. This has won that same Jim Murray recognition 3 consecutive years.
Yeah, I think it was 3. Yeah.
Bourbon has won it a couple times, and there were a couple other winners, but David sort of ended the 3-year streak, the three-peat of my other friends also at Garrison Brothers. But David talked about learning from mistakes, and in my upcoming book about learning from mistakes, there are stories both from David and his distillery and his Toyota days, and Dan Garrison and Donis Todd, whose names are on these bottles, of them also having a culture of learning from mistakes and some great stories. And if it's not correlation, it's causation. I'm going to say a culture of learning from mistakes leads to award-winning bourbon. I said it.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and I think that's the spirit. It's the learning mindset. As David talked about, was just, hey, the show came. I went to go look at the recipe. Did it with a learner's mindset, which is not what he said, but is just who he is, right? And so did it with a learner's mindset. New insights and lessons came out of that, and that's I think that's what it's really all about, and that's that's the take of your book, which is that learner's mindset of how mistakes lead to lead to progress, lead to improvement, self-improvement, organizational improvement, and everything else.
And like you said, that's the spirit.
Yeah, that is the spirit. Yeah, there you go. So, yeah, I stumble into puns every once in a while. So,
I forget what comedian I'm thinking of, but I remember him saying something like, "People don't care if your puns were intended or not." You know, when people will say, "Pun, no pun intended." Like,
yeah,
we don't care.
Just own it. Just own it. Just accept it. Just win the day. Yeah, when we mean it, we want full credit for it, and when we don't want people to think that we made a joke that didn't land, right? So we want to backdoor out of our puns. So speaking of learning and mistakes, or perhaps not, we have a topic that we wanted to get into today, which was around the improvement or not of patient safety.
The numbers seem to show, and I've seen experts say, not improve, generally speaking. Thank you for trying to segue that, because I didn't know how I was going to pull that off, going from lighthearted, fun, lean.
Sometimes we don't care about a segue.
Next topic. But yeah, there were big headlines this week and articles going around, trying to compare back to 1999, the famed Institute of Medicine report to Err is Human that estimated, and we can get into this, why it's only estimates, between 44,000 and 98,000 Americans dying each year due to medical error. A couple of years ago, there was a different study that said 1 out of every 4 Medicare patients who were admitted to hospitals were harmed by a quote unquote adverse event. And I'd always thought, well, I don't know why Medicare patients would be any more unlucky than the general population. You can say, well, are they prone to adverse events, which includes errors, mistakes, process problems? The new study that came out in the New England Journal of Medicine said 1 out of 4 hospitalized patients experiences an adverse event, and there's kind of a breakdown that we can drill into, and questions around, like, there are certainly pockets of excellence. I know stories and examples of people who have eliminated certain types of harm, certain infections, falls, pressure ulcers, but the old expression that was popular at MIT, William Gibson, the science fiction author, who said the future has already been invented, it's just not widely distributed yet. And I would say the same thing applies to radically better patient safety.
Yeah, and so this New England Journal of Medicine report was picked up by NBC News. I mean, they actually covered it. I'm pretty sure they covered it in the 6:30 news with Lester Holt. And of course, as soon as I heard it, it's like 1 in 4 have adverse effects. I'm like, that number's huge. That sounds massive. And this is why headlines versus, the depth of the story matters so much, because, right out of the gate, I think it was, and I don't know if we have this number captured or extracted, but I think 60% of them, or over 60% of them, were, some version of like side effects from, maybe it was 40% were side effects from medicine, which, it can be an adverse effect, but it was known and intended when you chose to take that.
Yeah, there's a difference between, oh, we didn't realize that medication was going to cause a problem, and then there's, we gave you the wrong medicine, like not the one we intended to give. And then there's, we gave it to you even though there was a known allergy. There are different levels of, like, clearly preventable, that shouldn't have happened events versus things that were just a bad outcome. But if you look at some of the numbers, and first off, it's important to say these are estimates. These are not known numbers. So what happens in these studies is, in this case, they reviewed 2,800 admissions from 11 Massachusetts hospitals in 2018. That's not many. Like, there's a big health system here in the DFW area that has 200,000 admissions a year across their hospital. So here's a sampling of a sample, and they have to do this chart review and surmise what happened because there's not mandatory non-punitive reporting like you would have in, say, aviation. So, they
Right.
say, well,
And just to tie into aviation, right? We have a massive incident this week where at JFK there was a near miss where a Delta jet almost ran into, I'll say, one of my Delta jets almost ran into one of your American Airlines, since
right.
those tend to be the airlines we probably on more. But the near miss by 1,000 yards or something, I can't remember what the number was national news.
Right.
And everything's reported.
There's no hiding it, though. There's no
No hiding it.
When people realize their plane suddenly hit the brakes during takeoff, and then there's the disclosure. I'm screwing up and citing a different comedian who says it's really a near collision, not a near miss.
Right.
We use that term in healthcare too, but there's a problem in healthcare, as Don Berwick pointed out. Dr. Don Berwick, founder of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, pointed out in his commentary piece that went along with the study. He's like, well, why didn't the study talk about near misses? That's an opportunity for learning, whether it's a distillery or aviation or a hospital.
Yeah, and the whole idea of near miss, which is probably very much the wrong word compared to near collision or near accident. But the reason we look at that, so let's just take manufacturing and safety incidents. The reason we look at near misses so aggressively is that there's a ton more data, right? Because there's just more of them. There's more to learn out of them. And quite frankly, when you really study, especially safety incidents, but I would suggest this applies to, healthcare adverse effects as well, is that the difference between a bad outcome and a good outcome from a near miss is random. It's just random luck, right? So you trip and fall. Did you land on something sharp and pointy or not is just luck, right? It was the fall that caused it, and sometimes it has an adverse outcome and sometimes it doesn't. So you eliminate the fall, you eliminate the adverse effect.
Then the near miss is I tripped over something, but I thankfully, you look at the Toyota factory walking safety rules. You trip over, you stumble, but your hands weren't in your pockets and you weren't looking at your phone and you managed to balance yourself and you didn't fall. That's also an opportunity for learning, because if you don't learn from the stumble, then someone is going to trip and fall and get hurt and maybe hit their head and die.
Yeah.
The proportions, and it's I think it's called Heinrich pyramid, that Alcoa and other safety experts point to this ratio of about, I think it's about 10 to 1.
10 to 1. Yep.
Fatalities, serious harm, injuries, near misses. Like, there are so many more near misses to learn from. That's how you prevent the severe injuries and the fatalities.
Yeah, and when you look at this, in healthcare in particular, if once you have an adverse effect, there's a decent chance that lawyers end up involved, right? And so there's a resistance to be too forthcoming because we say too much and it ends up in a deposition, so on and so forth. But if you look at the near misses, there's no lawyers involved, right? Because nothing bad happened. And so that's why I feel it's a shame that we're not better at leveraging that in healthcare, because it's less risky to look at and it's much richer in terms of data and opportunity, et cetera.
And that's the connection between psychological safety leading to physical safety. If people point out a risk or a near miss, or I made a mistake, but we caught it and it didn't hurt somebody, if the reaction is punishment, people learn to not speak up. And that's the psychological safety challenge in healthcare. But, to go through some of these numbers here, you can get a free account on the New England Journal of Medicine website that gives you 2 articles a month. So you can get the study, and then you can get the Don Berwick piece, which is a nice summary and some of his commentary, but some of the numbers.
His 2-page summary is fantastic.
Yeah, it's executive summary, and with some opinion, which I think we can touch on here too. But so again, estimates from this limited chart review, and then they extrapolate. But from the chart review, 23% adverse events, which, and like, I'm always careful of euphemisms, right? Or, just language, it's interesting. But then 9% of admissions had a quote unquote serious adverse event. So not 9% of the adverse events, but 9%. So 1 in 10 admissions had a serious adverse event. But then here's what I think this is interesting, and I don't think it was super clear other than it being a matter of professional opinion, that 22.7% of the adverse events were, quote, judged to be preventable. So then you end up saying, well, there was a preventable adverse event in 7% of all admissions, and then you start doing the math, and here's I think the most shocking number. Preventable adverse events categorized as serious, life-threatening, or fatal were identified in approximately 1%. So that's 1 out of 100 admitted patients, and I'm not naming names here, and I'm not saying they're atypical, but major DFW area health system with 200,000 hospital admissions a year, that would mean 2,000 serious, life-threatening, or fatal incidents a year.
Yep.
That's huge.
It's huge, and obviously, if you're already close to healthcare, they can then deal with the adverse event and hopefully prevent it from becoming a fatal event, right? Which is some of the times why you're like, well, we want you to sit here for a few hours, right? We want to, because that's when the adverse effect will take place. And so knowing, when it's knowable versus the, most of the preventable ones are, mistakes and errors. And so you didn't know to hang on to a patient, watch them or anything else. But the known ones, the unpreventable ones, like when we give you this medication, it may cause a stroke, right? Okay. Well, if it causes a stroke, it's now a serious life-threatening event, but you're already in the hospital. So,
well, there's a difference between known risk, but it's better than not using the medication. The risk of not doing it is worse than the risk of trying it. But then, there are, the wrong side surgeries, the wrong medications being given, different complex systems issues that lead to patients getting infections, pressure ulcers, and being injured by falls. And so, I think for one, like, I wish there was a separation between bad outcome and error or mistake. Not all bad outcomes are caused by a mistake.
Right.
Like, I would want to look at data that way. And then there's the debate around what's preventable. And Don Berwick in his piece, and I, for what it's worth, I would fall in his camp, and some others I've talked to this week agree. He says, Dr. Don Berwick said, it's better to consider this to be all preventable. Let's not make, I'm paraphrasing now, let's not make excuses for problems we haven't yet figured out how to solve. Because even some of these things like central line associated bloodstream infections, there was a time when people would have said, well, those aren't preventable until guess what? People figured out how.
That's right.
And so I'm not going to say 100% of these defined adverse events are preventable. I would say 100% of mistakes and errors are preventable. And then there's a certain medical knowledge frontier that would allow us to prevent some of the bad outcomes in the future as we learn and improve.
No, and some of this comes from, we've invented more aggressive, invasive medicines to do very specific things that, we haven't been able to do before, like cure cancer. And those have, because of how aggressive those medicines are, they can cause those adverse events. We haven't figured out how to not let that happen. So that's a knowledge thing, right? We just have more science to do. But mistakes or errors, are things that are preventable for a whole bunch of reasons, including process improvement, training, culture, etc.
As the expression goes, from the mouths of babes, honesty, I guess, comes from kids, or but not babies. But I got to go speak a couple of times to a high school program in San Antonio. It's kind of like an alternative to college, and kids. It's a partnership between the school district and the local community college, and it's a really highly acclaimed program. Toyota sponsors it for like future manufacturing, advanced manufacturing professionals. But on the healthcare side of things, I got to come and give a talk, and these are kids who want to be nurses, surgeons, pharmacists, all kinds of different careers. And I sort of tried to gently touch on the subject of errors and harm, and just they don't know what they don't know yet, and kind of brought up the idea of, let's say, a wrong site or wrong side surgery, and you share some statistics, and the kids are stunned, like they haven't yet considered that might happen. But then I asked them, well, why do you think things like that might occur? Not a single kid who raised their hand to say anything was blaming individuals. They're saying, well, these are bad doctors or dumb surgeons. I mean, like they had such good intuition around, well, it's probably miscommunications, or I think I remember another kid said like, well, maybe they were rushing, which again, you might say, well, that's not just an individual problem. If systemic problems have forced the surgical schedule to run 5 hours behind, it's inevitable that people might rush. So how do you prevent the situations where people pressure themselves into rushing and becoming more error prone? Or a kid might say, oh, well, they might have been tired. I'm like, God, these kids, I mean, they get it.
Yeah, which is why I like first appointments of the day for two reasons. The schedule can't get that far behind if the first appointment of the day, and they're less likely to be tired. I'll say less likely because plenty of people wake up tired, but
yeah.
But when I had my knee surgery in November, I was sitting there in pre-op, and at this point I'm locked and loaded. Like I have very little choice but to go forward. But I heard, while I was sitting there waiting for my turn, I heard 4 things fall on the floor. I don't know what those things were. One was probably a pen, right? But nevertheless, I'm like, I know it's pre-op, not the actual surgical room, but I still think things shouldn't be falling on the floor with the prevalence they seem to be.
Yeah.
Do we not have a place to put things? Do things not have a holder? Or is it interim processing? But there's a little bit. All I'm hearing is process problems while I'm sitting there, ready to go under the knife. But it can be little things like that, right? Where you put something down in the wrong place, you get distracted, you get interrupted. There is science, I think mostly done by NASA, on how much interruptions can cost you focus and things like that. And so you just sit there and again, I'm watching with a process lens, and I'm seeing somebody do something and someone asks them a question while they're in the middle of it. And then I hear them go, what was I doing again?
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, that's how things go wrong. Right. So it is, it can be the environment, it can be the system, it can be the process, and it can even be the training. Right. I also saw, and this is again, just sitting there for a little while in pre-op, I also saw a nurse trying to understand a standard work chart to mix a particular medication, I think for someone who's diabetic, and the anesthesiologist had to come in and explain it because the chart wasn't self-evident. And I'm fine with all of that, except, was this a new nurse asking the right question, or was this a bad chart, or, these are the questions that I would be asking had I not been, in a gown laying in a bed.
Right. But before that moment, let me ask this. I mean, is you're deciding, you're being convinced by the doctor, okay, you need this surgery. As a patient, as a quote unquote healthcare consumer, to think of, well, who should I have do the surgery, and where should I have the surgery? Like, where would you even was that even a consideration? Or do you say, well, I don't know. I got referred to this surgeon, and they seem to know what they're doing, and this is where they do surgery. So, okay, I'm on board. I mean, what?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say I didn't do a lot of research. relative to what I could have. I got a good referral. I heard from multiple people that he was a good surgeon. And I was kind of like, well, okay, if he's not, if he's not a lot of other things, once I'm unconscious, I want a good surgeon. So I heard that from a lot of people that knew his reputation from various different sources. The only thing on the location that to me was reassuring, and I don't know if this is valid or not, is that it was a standalone orthopedic surgical unit, which meant it's not going to, that's all they do. So they have their routines. It's a particular type of surgeries. They can fine tune to a narrower set of doctors with a more specific set of expectations, and not mix in with, heart transplants or whatever, right? So I saw that as a good thing. It wouldn't have changed my mind because I was really selecting the doctor and trusting him to select the surgical unit. But being, but I do pay attention to that as I go forward. But, I don't also, as a I don't want to say self-proclaimed because I almost never call myself this, but as a self-proclaimed expert in, process improvement, I'm not an expert in this field. And so while I know how probable risks and mistakes can be, I'm also well aware of my limitations in judging their particular process.
And data is really hard to find. I mean, you can look at CMS website and look for a star rating for a particular hospital. You could look at a Leapfrog group letter grade, but those assessments are only as good as the data that's available. And a lot of hospitals refuse to report anything beyond the minimal data. They don't partner with Leapfrog Group to be transparent about their data. But even at a hospital level, there could be variation in practices amongst surgeons, and there could be some operating rooms that are just dirtier than others. It shouldn't be that way. Within a hospital or some of the older operating rooms that are maybe harder to clean, or with airflow that's not as good, are the infection rates higher in certain operating rooms? We certainly don't have knowledge or visibility to that. But I've got this hypothesis that I've talked to a couple patient safety experts and including physicians recently that what would be a high leverage piece of data? And one of those pieces of data, if it was publicly reported, might be employee turnover rates. And I would try to connect dots between all of the things being equal. Higher turnover rates tells me there's maybe problems with the culture. There are maybe other issues, and it's not, teams that haven't worked together as long, and there might be a number of dynamics, but that data point right there, your annualized voluntary turnover rate might be a predictor of some of these other bad outcomes that we would certainly want to avoid as a patient.
Right. Yeah, and as we look at, again, the data is not good enough, which is why this study that we're kind of building this off of had to have such a low sample rate, right? It's kind of like, I always say this when I work with an organization and how do we measure our problem solving? And quantity is easy, right? How many A3s did we do, right? But what about the quality? Well, it's kind of hard to judge without opening up an A3 and evaluating it. And you can't do that with all the A3s because you'll invest an equal amount of resources in judging it as you do in doing it.
It's labor intensive to do these reviews.
Super labor intensive, right? And this is the same, because we don't have the measurement systems, the data transparency, all these other things, this study had to be very narrow in order to go deep enough to make any sorts of judgments. So I think just the study methodology proves that we don't have a good grasp of the problem. At least we don't have as good a grasp of the problem as we should relative to its importance and even relative to how much GDP we spend on it, right? If you just look at the GDP, you would think, well, okay, we're going to spend this many dollars on healthcare. Maybe we should spend some amount of dollars on studying it as well. But I think we spent more dollars on studying much smaller problems than this.
Yeah, I mean, there are huge opportunities to get better data, to get better sharing and learning across different organizations. I mean, if one organization has figured out how to reduce, how to basically eliminate CLABSI infections, and that was maybe 10 or 15 years ago, there's really no good excuse for why that hasn't happened everywhere now.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's just not. And, there are different opportunities and countermeasures being proposed. Let me make a plug real quick for a panel discussion I'm going to be hosting on January 25th with a couple of people who are really involved in these proposals. And there was a bill introduced into the House last December, lame duck session. And I don't know from a political standpoint what will go anywhere, but there's this proposal for a national patient safety board. Not at all coincidental that it sounds like National Transportation Safety Board.
Mm-hmm.
Would have certain responsibilities. They're not going to dive in and solve all of the patient safety problems at hospitals everywhere, but to have some body that has roles, including collecting data, doing some investigations, and then maybe more importantly, sharing knowledge. Maybe we can put a link in the show notes, or people can contact me for information about.
Yeah, no, let's definitely share that. And this is, again, we do see evidence to your, point of hospital-acquired infections and things like that. There is evidence, and Dr. Berwick points to this, where there was process improvement on known problems. Things got better, yes. Right? And it sort of suggests, an important aspect, which I love to talk about in problem solving, which is break down the problem.
Right.
Don't try to solve patient safety. Try to solve this adverse outcome from this cause. Now you have a possibility of success. Can't solve patient safety, right? Yeah. But you can solve 101 different situations or sub-problems or specific problems within patient safety.
Yeah.
And if you break down problems and look at them one by one, cause by cause, process by process, you can make real progress. Yeah. And, that begins at a hospital level, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. To your one of the big points is then it should be able to be spread further. You would think all these hospital conglomerates that buy up hospitals and build big entities would make that better, but it doesn't, unfortunately.
It doesn't, and I'm going to be interviewing a doctor. It's a psychiatrist who I talked to her the other day in advance of doing a podcast interview with her in one of the other podcasts I host called Habitual Excellence. And she quit practicing medicine about 10 years ago. I think as she put it, there's no business model that's compatible with doing the right thing for the patients and having a reasonable living and a reasonable work-life existence. So she's got a book coming out soon. It's titled, "If I Betray These Words, Moral Injury in Medicine and Why It's So Hard for Clinicians to Put Patients First." And there are a lot of systemic issues, overburden, financial pressures, compensation, design. Then there's a lot of process issues. So I'll bring it back to lean. You look at examples where Toyota worked with Children's Health here in Dallas to reduce infections. It was a certain type of infection. And it comes down, I forget if it was that case study or others, but don't put sterile items down on the patient bed. Back to your point of do you not have a proper sterile place to put things down on? They address lots of tactical little things. Now, my one concern sorry that I named names, but it would be a concern either way, is that once Toyota's out of the picture, did they sustain anything?
Mm-hmm.
TSSC, the good people there, came in, drove great problem solving, drove results. Will it sustain? But yeah, you're right. You got to break down the problem, look at your Pareto chart of your highest harms, incidents, and there's probably some systemic problems where fixing some things that reduce that type of infection will also have positive effects elsewhere. But a lot of it then is, kind of nitty gritty process improvement. But any hospital that wants to learn how to eliminate CLABSIs can look at what's been learned and reported by Dr. Rick Shannon,
Mm-hmm.
who learned from Paul O'Neill and he learned from Steve Spear. And the knowledge is out there, but where are the competitive dynamics that would really make it necessary instead of nice to have?
Yep. And to the point around some of the psychological pressures that get in the way of some of the learning and openness and experimentation, all that kind of stuff. Healthcare is in a dire state right now, and those pressures are greater, that really make things harder than ever. We've had significant turnover, significant retirees. We brought on a ton of new staff, which in itself is a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Healthcare staffing around the world is hot. This isn't just a U.S. thing. Like, you go to almost any developed country, and the healthcare staffing is at new all-time highs, but demand is even higher.
Right.
And so the patient to staff ratio has gotten out of kilter, and it shows up in a whole lot of ways. Hospital waiting times, queues to get elective procedures, to get even lab results, ambulances waiting outside hospitals to drop off patients, unable to, we won't we won't take that patient. They sit in the ambulance for sometimes ridiculous periods because they don't have a bed for them. So, and a lot of this has happened. COVID is still a very big number in hospitals.
Sure.
You have an increase in other infectious diseases, flu and RSV being two that are talked about quite a bit. And you have, we talk about hijunka, right? In general, people get, the biggest risk to level loading, hijunka, level loading demand in hospitals used to be population bubbles, right? Aging baby boomers creates a bubble, which increases demand. But now we've created an artificial bubble because a lot of people deferred things over the last couple of years, both procedures and screenings and even elective surgeries and things like that. And now that is creating a bubble, which is pinching and unleveling demand.
Yeah.
So in the end, right, if people are under a lot of pressure just to get through the next patient, you don't have a lot of time to work on your process improvement.
Right. But I think, there's 2 points I would make to that. One is, don't let hospitals blame COVID for everything, because these problems were problems before COVID.
Absolutely.
Safety problems, staff retention problems, quality of work life. That's an old term that I pulled out of auto industry term from the 80s. But there's all been, whether you call it burnout or moral injury, these things were already problems before COVID, probably made worse by COVID in different ways. And then I think, as you're alluding to, these are not just American problems, right? Like this doctor author I talked to the other day, talking about business models, and I asked her, look at other countries where it's government run or government funded healthcare, and is this moral injury, these problems for providers just as bad in other places? She's like, oh yeah. If it's not problems caused by organization, the health systems or the insurers, or in other countries, it's what you might call the tyranny of budgets. Like, oh, we've run out of money, and that interferes with doctors being able to fulfill their mission to do the right things for the patients.
Right.
And that mismatch of, I want to do the right thing and you're not letting me do it is part of what creates that quote unquote moral injury. And it's more, I'm still learning about this, but it seems more along the lines of like PTSD than it is like burnout. Like it's more severe and gosh, than quote unquote burnout. And I think she makes another good point too. Like, don't blame the people who are quote unquote burned out. You need to blame those that are creating the injury, whether we can figure out what to do about it or not.
Right. Yeah, and like most organizations, right? There's certain. We'll just use this as the case, and we're not painting a too broad a brush here, but hospital administrators had to keep their distance during COVID, right? Lots and lots of isolation, lots and lots of separation. Work from home. Don't just go do Gemba observations in a COVID ward just because you're curious, right? So that became very, that was already, to your point, that was already a problem. Disengaged hospital leadership made worse by COVID. And if you haven't reversed that trend, how do I get to the point of activity to really see what people are going through?
And there are a lot of complaints that have been made of, the healthcare providers who are overburdened and not supported enough, complaining about their executives who are all working from home. And like, there's something to be said for, mask up, gallon up, take on a little bit of risk. Don't ask your employees to do something you wouldn't do.
Yeah.
I think is an important leadership principle. But again, like even pre-COVID, I can't tell you how many times I've seen, hospital executive leadership being in literally a different building that's not the hospital. And I'm not talking health system headquarters.
Right.
Like I'm talking like a relatively small town community hospital, in the executive suite is like across the road, maybe connected with, a bridge, a covered climate controlled bridge across the road. And like, I'll make this analogy for this audience of like, could you imagine a factory? How good do you think a factory would be if executive leadership were in trailers on the far end of the parking lot for their offices?
Yep.
Wouldn't work.
Although we've seen it, and sometimes just an alleyway might as well be 1,000 yards. We've seen this in I'll share two extreme environments. Semiconductors. I worked with one manager who put badge access readers into the semiconductor clean room fab. Is years and years ago, and one of the things he learned is his managers were never going to the floor because he had the data now because he had to scan in. Another extreme. Years and years ago, we were working in an environment, very heavy metal, big things being welded. You couldn't walk out on the floor without steel toe shoes, among other things, right? Among other PPE. And we were doing an event. It wasn't my event, but we were doing an event, and we had all these people that had to go out on the floor. And one of the I don't know if they were an exec or a manager said, "Oh, I've got to go get steel toe shoes." They didn't have them, which was just a clear evidence. They never went out to the floor.
Remind them they also need safety glasses with side shields.
So not unique to healthcare, not a new problem, but again, work from home, COVID just created one more barrier from people going to where the work is done and understanding the condition people are dealing with.
And one other thing that all reminds me of, flashback to my first year at General Motors, when I saw firsthand and learned how, the UAW production employees cared about quality. Even after being in crappy work environments for 35 years, they had pride in what they knew they needed to do. And of countless examples of management making dumb decisions that hurt quality. And the employees would grumble about it, but I don't think it kept them up at night. Like, they still were getting they could have and should have been treated better. And the second plant manager I worked under, was a NUMI trained guy, started changing that. But I don't think it probably wasn't keeping him up at night. Like they would grumble, but I don't think it would rock them to their core. It's one thing to have, a Cadillac engine that fails in the first 100 miles under a customer's hood.
Right.
Like you can live with that. But like, this level, I don't think the term moral injury would apply there. But when it comes to physicians, not being able to do what they think is needed for their patients, that's got to be a whole different level of gut punch when leaders are making dumb decisions that hurt quality and safety.
Agreed. Yep. That's a tough one.
It's sad.
So have we solved it yet?
Another ounce of whiskey? Will that get us closer?
Another ounce of whiskey. I got to measure this bottle. Hang on. I think we're probably more than a bottle away from solving it.
Yeah.
But hopefully we shine a light on, the problem we face as a society, first and foremost, as a hospital system, as patients, and and the ecosystem that serves all of that, and many different problems to be solved, all interconnected. So don't just sit there and complain. Understand it, and understand either what you can do to protect yourself or what you can do to make it better,
or what you can do to help spread known, proven solutions that are existing in small pockets. How do we make that the new norm? And then speaking of solutions, I just want to give a kind of a final shout out to Don Berwick. I hope people will go read his piece. I mean, I've only met him briefly at one of their IHI national forums. The one year I was able to attend, lean was a big theme that year. He talked about it in his keynote address. Like he actually had a really good definition of value, which he traced back to basically not just longevity, but quality of life. So value is not just quality over cost for that knee procedure, but what's the impact to you, Jamie, of having that knee surgery?
Right.
And connecting the dots in really meaningful ways between lean terminology and what that might mean in healthcare. And he's not all lean all the time, but he's certainly not anti-lean, nor is IHI. It's funny. It's all in Cambridge. IHI's offices were in Harvard Square. LEI had offices when I worked there. Were 2 train stops down in Kendall Square by MIT.
Yep.
And Don Berwick and Jim Womack had met each other and knew each other well enough to basically LEI and the legal structure and the filings and the nonprofit status was completely modeled after IHI because Don Berwick helped out Jim Womack.
Right.
Well, historical tidbit there.
Neat.
Yeah. So thank you to Don Berwick for that commentary and the support for lean and how that needs to fit into back to your point of solutions, not just complaints.
Yeah, he's a champion among champions, without a doubt. He's been at this a long time.
And I'm going to mention Dr. Deming because Don Berwick was of the era of having worked directly with W. Edwards Deming, along with Paul Batalden and some of the other legends of that generation of people in the patient safety movement. The Deming influence is clear. And in his piece in the Journal of Medicine, New England Journal of Medicine, I hope people will read, Don Berwick still cites Deming and the phrase constancy of purpose.
Right up front.
The headline of the piece.
Opening paragraph, right?
And then the other phrase, and this comes back to maybe the complaining, there he uses the phrase missing in action in the headline. So, where has been why haven't we had more progress? Has patient safety improvement been missing in action? I think that was part of his point.
Yeah. Yep. So he's the champion of a lot of this, and Mantle, you've helped extend, and lots of work left to be done. And as we indicated, we weren't going to solve it tonight over a glass of Glens Creek. as good as that might be. But
Here's my Glenn's. I'm drinking water to hydrate out of my Glenn's Creek glass. And then as Dave noticed, I think before we started, when we talked to him earlier, before, it wasn't a surprise that he jumped in. So sorry to tell you how the sausage was made. I've got a Glenn's Creek Distilling T-shirt on, which I think is now retro at this point.
Yeah, that's retro because that's an old logo for him, I guess, or old design. Certainly an old T-shirt. So.
Yeah, so I'm glad it would have been more fun to keep talking with Dave about whiskey and lean for an hour, but thanks.
Well, we'll do that as you mentioned. Hopefully we'll do that in person sometime and record over in Glens Creek Distillery in Kentucky. So
we talk about the super serious stuff around healthcare. Just calling back quickly to the last episode, when we talked about Starbucks, which is far less meaningful. Have you been to a Starbucks since then, Jamie? Have you gone to Gemba? Have you had any customer observations? You need to do that. Come on.
I do, because I make my own espresso at home with a pretty decent machine and a single dose grinder and all that kind of stuff. I know the kind of espresso I get there. I was actually where was I? I was at a location and I think it was Bethlehem, but I needed a spot to camp out in between some appointments, and I found a coffee shop which just wasn't much better. A little better than Starbucks, but not much better. But
you should maybe do a side-by-side tasting of their quote-unquote blonde espresso with the regular espresso. Tell me what you think.
Maybe, but the beans, there's more to it than the beans, let's just say. So an unburnt bean is probably an improvement, but when you're really not gonna when it's just a push button, it's going to be hard to create the same outcome as a craft. But it's more reliable, it's more consistent, but hard to beat the outcome. So
it's far more likely we'll get to do the episode with Dave than have some executive from Starbucks come and
probably, but we're open, right? We're happy to have them, especially if they have some bourbon roasted beans or barrel aged beans or whatever that might result in. So.
All right, so maybe we'll touch on that again next time. So I've already answered the question inadvertently that we were going to wrap up with. I've already mentioned mine. I'll recap before we wrap up. But Jamie, is there a recent book you've read that's not about lean that you've read and would recommend?
Yeah, so it's a book I'm reading now that I wouldn't recommend, and I have this compulsion to finish once I start.
Do tell.
I don't even remember the name of it. I'd have to go look it up because I once I start reading it. But it's about Russia, and it's meant to underscore the culture of Russia and why Russia is the way that it is, right? Because we look at Russia and we go, oh, it's irrational.
Yeah.
And this book is sort of arguing, well, yeah, but if you look at what happened post-Soviet collapse became a mafia state and then an organized mafia that essentially kind of ended up as, government acting like mafia, it all starts to make sense.
But you've probably got to go back to the czars, and you've had authoritarian leadership there for centuries.
Yeah, you could. This book didn't. And so it was one of my complaints about the book. It was a little high on storytelling, a little low on analysis. But so it's personal taste. But the book I did enjoy and find interesting was I always forget how to pronounce this, ikigai, which is a Japanese word that is really about purpose in life. And there's sort of a core take on this word that's Japanese that is. It's why tea is served the way that it is, because it's not about drinking the tea. It's about the purpose of the whole ritual and all of that. And so it's having purpose in what you do, relationships and everyday purpose, and staying active. Then there's a career version of this, which really co-opted that word, took another model that was already about career purpose, and then, overlaid the two and say, oh, that's about purpose, and this was about purpose, so we're going to call this sort of career ikigai.
Because there's diagrams. It's like a massive super Venn diagram that people love sharing on LinkedIn, right?
Right. That's the one I'm talking about, and it's not actually even the diagram is created by somebody else. It was not that diagram was not ikigai, but since whoever created the diagram put purpose at the middle, and ikigai is about purpose, then then people renamed it ikigai, career ikigai, and that's what it's all about. And so it's a great Venn diagram. Don't get me wrong. Just it's not really what all ikigai is about. And for me, there's all sorts of stuff in the book. So some of it I go a little too far into, like here's the Japanese daily exercises, the radio. I forget the name of the daily exercises, but it's an interesting book, really exploring about longevity in life and what keeps us going. And a lot of what I take away from it. So since I mentioned espresso, I'll use that as an example. I could be efficient, hit a button on an espresso machine, go do other things, come back, drink my espresso, and it would be 80% as good as the espresso I make. Mm-hmm. But for me, it's not about just drinking the espresso. It's about the act of paying attention to what I'm doing. Trying to do it, not thinking about anything else while I'm making an espresso. I'm trying to do every step well, because if I don't, it won't be as good. And so it's an immersion in what I'm trying to do, and be with that moment, be with that process. And it still only takes a couple minutes, but It's 2 minutes of complete focus on the task at hand. I'm not distracted by anything else or just trying to be efficient. And I think that's a lot about what I take away from the book. I will say, I find it interesting that there is this sort of undertone in lean cultures that, everything Japanese is associated with lean and vice versa. And I don't really, I appreciate Japanese culture. I've been there. I love it. But there's things in Japanese culture that you can see in Toyota. And there's things you can see in Toyota that you can't see anywhere else in Japanese culture.
Right. Toyota is not like every other Japanese company.
Not even close. So I like to say, is the companies I've visited in Japan, I found more badly run companies in Japan than I have in America. Now, I've also found some extremely well-run companies in Japan, but to me, there's everything, studying lean isn't about studying everything Japanese, but nevertheless, Ikigai is an interesting book, and so I enjoyed reading that.
Yeah, cool.
And so you already mentioned your book, but this is a forthcoming read for you, right?
It will be. And I was going to mention first, our mutual friend Adam Zach, who joined us on an episode of Lean Whiskey, had reached out to me, and I don't know if he meant to reach out to you, because you had Okay, he reached out because you had posted about this book on LinkedIn, and Adam emailed me, and I'm like, I barely know the word, but Jane, you should. Okay, so I'm glad we got you connected. So the book I mentioned, I believe, is coming out in March or April, because I'm interviewing one of the authors, Dr. Wendy Dean. I'll have an opportunity, I think, to get an advanced read. First, when you had posed this question, I'll admit to not reading a whole lot while I'm in book writing and book finishing mode.
Yeah, I get that way too. Yeah.
But again, like this book, it's titled "If I Betray These Words: Moral Injury in Medicine and Why It's So Hard for Clinicians to Put Patients First." And that phrase, "If I betray these words," I'm trying to think if that's. I'm going to do a quick Googling, that's got to come from the Hippocratic Oath or something of kind of swearing to uphold certain values.
Right.
And then the longer version of the phrase, so the book, the longer version of the phrase is, "May I be destroyed if I betray these words." That's a heavy burden that people in other fields and professions and disciplines don't face, right? Like if you or I were to go do a crappy job giving a presentation, or nobody dies. Like it would be embarrassing, and I'm not saying.
So we both lose sleep over it, but yeah. And notice it doesn't say "May I be destroyed by lawyers," right? So
Right.
it's a self accountability phrase, which is which is an important aspect, I think, of the healthcare professions and the professionals within it is self accountability. And
Yeah.
I think since we talked about healthcare so much, I think we shouldn't forget that that's the center of the bulk of that culture. Is the deep desire to do well by patients.
It's self-motivated, and this might be historically accurate to say, considering how long I think the Hippocratic Oath goes back, of not angering the gods, plural.
Right. So that's the moral responsibility. So to the doctors and nurses and practitioners in healthcare who do strive to learn and improve and make the system better, and all the other people that make that happen, and of course to David and Glens Creek Distillery, cheers.
So congratulations to Dave, and then I don't think I'm betraying her trust. Dr. Dean did mention to me that she had listened to my lean podcast and she had listened to lean whiskey, and I'm thinking, oh no, like that's not the best representation. No offense to this podcast, but she said, oh, she listened to it because she likes whiskey too.
There we go.
So
maybe maybe another future guest. So
cheers to Dr. Dean.
Fantastic.
James, cheers to you.
Cheers.